No, but you can press off.
Good evening, everyone. I call this meeting to order. It's a work session, and delighted to have this many. Normally, we have work sessions in there much smaller. So we do welcome you. Our regular council meeting is scheduled for 7, but we have a little bit of flexibility there, and we'll talk about that as we go further. And any other comments to begin with?
Just a quick reminder, Mr. Mayor and Council, work sessions are primarily for the council and staff. There is no public testimony during a work session normally. If people do have opinions they want to share with council, during your regular business meeting, you have citizen comments, and folks can certainly sign up and provide their viewpoint on this issue that's in front of you tonight during that time. It just won't be during the work session.
Thank you. That is item 6 on the agenda, if you have the agenda for tonight's session. And we invite you to comment at that time if that's something you desire to do.
Mayor, I have a question.
Please.
Is Mayor-elect Mays participating in the conversation tonight?
I would welcome him to participate.
Can I ask that maybe he come up here? It seems kind of awkward having him out there if he's going to participate. Is that permissible?
I'm fine with that.
Concur. Welcome, sir.
Oh, you're sitting here. Okay.
Right. This is good.
No, you're fine.
Okay, I think we're ready to start, and I'd like to introduce Carrie Brennicke, Senior Planner. Go for it.
Actually, it's going to be me. I'm going to do, sorry. Well, that does, to be fair, that is absolutely what the agenda says, and you are not wrong. That Carrie was going to be doing the presentation. And I am going to do most of it, but I do want to recognize Carrie Brennicke and Erica Palmer, as well as Bob Bellotti, who's hiding in the first row, because I could not do this without them. This is the absolute team effort. And so I'm going to be the speaking part, but they're going to chime in and add on as necessary. Slide. And I don't have a clicker, so Carrie's my clicker. So tonight we're going to talk, give you background on the urban reserves and the urban growth boundary, review the Sherwood West preliminary concept plan, review the analysis from the area that we identified in the letter of interest, as well as some potential alternatives, and then open it up for discussion. So this is hard to read, and I'm sorry for everybody, especially in the back of the room, but we wanted to really give you all some context of kind of the urban growth boundary decision. So before the urban and rural reserves process, Metro was required to consider urban growth boundary expansions based on soil type, and really that above everything else, which resulted in areas being brought into the urban growth boundary that weren't necessarily ideal and were small and piecemeal and not necessarily cohesive and well thought through. So that's sort of pre. In 2002, that's when Metro did their largest, most recent UGB expansion. They brought in 18,000 acres, over 18,000 acres into the urban growth boundary, and we're still seeing, Brookman was brought in during that phase, Area 59 was brought in during that phase. So there's a lot of areas that were brought in 2002 that are still not developing or slowly developing, and Damascus, I believe, came in during that process. In 2007, sort of in consideration of the issues with having to determine urban growth boundaries based on soil type, the legislature passed Senate Bill 1011, which established a process for designating urban and rural reserves. Between 2008 and 2010, Metro, the 4 counties, Washington County, Clackamas County, Multnomah County, the 3 counties, and local jurisdictions worked together to identify locations for urban reserves and rural reserves. And urban reserves were going to provide a 50-year supply of urbanizable land where Metro could consider expanding the urban growth boundary if and when they determined a need. And conversely, rural reserves was basically going to provide a 50-year protection of urban or rural lands for that same time period. So at the same time that counties were designating rural reserves, Metro was designating urban reserves, and they did that in coordination. In 2011, shortly after the reserves process was finished, actually the urban and rural reserves were acknowledged by Washington County. Metro did determine a need and added a little over 2,000 acres into the urban growth boundary at that time. And interestingly, we advocated for a portion of Sherwood West, which is actually kind of the where the school is essentially, and some areas around the school. But Metro didn't determine that there was a need to include all the areas that cities were interested in at that time. And part of that was because we really hadn't identified any planning for that area. We hadn't identified what we wanted and what our vision was and things like that. So in 2014, the city applied for and received funds from Metro to do our Sherwood West preliminary concept plan. And we actually began that process in 2014, completed it in 2016. During that process, Metro did do another urban growth report and determined that there wasn't a need to expand the urban growth boundary, but because we were just coming out of the recession, they did commit to look at it again in 3 years, which is essentially what we're doing for this 2018 ask. And then also in 2017, late 2016, 2017, Metro and local mayors discussed a framework for a mid-cycle review of the urban growth boundary that would allow local jurisdictions to advocate sort of mid-cycle if they had unique needs or they had special circumstances. And we have a slide later on that talks about it, but it's sort of like if there's really good cause and you've got some really legitimate arguments, you could potentially ask for small expansions of the urban growth boundary mid-cycle. So you don't have to wait 6 years necessarily. 3 years in, you could potentially get additional land. And then they also laid out the timeline for this 2018 ask. This map is just showing you all of the urban reserves. The brown areas are the urban reserves around the region. The green are rural reserves. So those are areas that for 50 years, Metro cannot consider for expansion. The white areas are undesignated, which in theory means that if you've used up all of your urban reserves and there's a need within that 50-year time frame, that may be where Metro would have to look for expansions, but that's many years out. Next slide. So this is just kind of zooming in on Sherwood. You can see the urban growth boundary is the red line. It's showing you it includes Brookman area as well as the Tonkin employment area. Brookman was brought in 2002. Tonkin employment area was brought in 2004. And then, as you may recall from the prior map, there are other urban reserves around Sherwood, but we're really focused on the Sherwood West Urban Reserve. The purpose of, again, the Sherwood West Urban Reserve was to provide a 50-year look at how and where development could occur and provide a roadmap for the future. Next slide. So we've given you a lot of background on, a quick background, I guess, on the urban growth boundary and urban reserves process. I want to pivot a little bit and talk about the Sherwood West preliminary concept plan. As I mentioned, we started that in 2014, and the idea was that we wanted to really, it was kind of a grassroots effort to say, what do we want? What does our community want this area to be, so that when and if we advocate again to Metro, we know what it is that we're advocating for. So through that process, there was a vision statement that was developed. Sherwood West complements the city's form and small town character through an integrated and continued pattern of the community's most valued neighborhoods. Through a range of well-designed housing options and protected natural areas, Sherwood West is a great place for families. It helps satisfy the city's need for well-planned growth and other community needs. Designed as a complete community, development is orderly, attractive, and protects views. The area is well administered, and development contributes to the fiscal health of Sherwood. So that was the vision that was identified. And this slide is really to highlight that this was a very involved public outreach effort. The staff at the time, they did everything. we joked that it was guerrilla style planning. They just showed up at events without having a booth, and they went to the Robin Hood Festival, they went to Music on the Green. We did an ice cream social to get input. It was really exciting, frankly, as a planner, to see how much excitement and attention there was to that at the time. This slide is showing you the goals and evaluation criteria for development for the Sherwood West Preliminary Concept Plan. The goal that growth is well planned, neighborhoods are phased adjacent to existing neighborhood. It's a well-phased extension of services, and there's lots of connectivity. The goal of design includes complete community attributes where you're incorporating nature, neighborhood retail, amenities that maybe can't be found in other locations around Sherwood, such as the Gateway District and things like that. A goal of development respecting and recognizing the Sherwood pattern, heritage, and small town feel. That was, through that process, they really looked at what is it about current Sherwood that makes us so special, and how do we replicate that in Sherwood West. And the attributes really identified were that it's walkable, there's view corridors and natural features that are retained, and integrating with the existing Sherwood through pedestrian connectivity and things like that. Promoting health, it's walkable, bikeable, with easy access to transportation choices. Development protects and provides access to nature. Again, a big component of that Sherwood West Preliminary Concept Plan is lots of retention of natural resources and view corridors and walking trails. And then implementation is pragmatic, optimizing infrastructure, balancing the benefits and burdens of development. Next slide. Oh, yeah, okay, I'll get onto the financing here in a minute. But so some major plan attributes of the Sherwood West Preliminary Concept Plan as a whole, again, the whole 1,291 acres. It's a 10-minute neighborhood, meaning you've got walkable communities, protection of resources, access to nature. There were 2 schools identified within the preliminary concept plan. They were envisioned to be smaller schools than the high school, but they were still envisioned. And then having some neighborhood serving retail, so you could walk and walk to your coffee shop and things like that. This plan is showing you option 1, and really the plans are pretty much identical with the exception of what happens to Elwort Road, and there wasn't strong consensus on Elwort Road, and so we carried forward both option 1 and option 2. Option 1 essentially has Elwort Road realigned so that it crosses the creek at a shorter distance, and then connects over. I don't know if we have a pointer, so I can't really show you what I'm talking about, but so it basically crosses the creek at 2 spots, but shorter, so we believe that to be less costly. And what it also does is it minimizes that regional through traffic, which the county actually didn't like, and is one of the reasons why we carried option 2 forward, which is Elwort Road remaining straight and widening. And we believe that to be much more expensive because of the span and the topography. It's essentially building a very long bridge across that creek and floodplain area. So that's really the difference between those 2 options. And as you'll see further in the presentation, the difference in the costs of those projects. So as we did the Sherwood West Preliminary Concept Plan, we did look at, again, high level, but we looked at infrastructure needs and costs, transportation, sanitary storm water, parks, and again, we did identify some potential school sites within that area. Keep in mind, we didn't zone anything, we haven't made any firm decisions, but it's just identifying that this is how these things could be accommodated within this area. And then, as I mentioned, it was really important to us that we identify kind of potential phasing and areas that could be brought in an orderly manner. And so we identified phasing, and we specifically we started having them numbered, but based on feedback and consideration, we did not number them 1, 2, 3, 4 because they're not intended to be, you're going to do this one first, this one second. It's just sort of what areas could potentially come in ways that could make sense if you were going to bring in a smaller area or not. And again, this is before we did the analysis that we've done for this ask, and we have a lot more information now than we did then that I think could have affected our recommendations even through that process. But so this is just showing you the potential, the phasing for option 1 and option 2 through that process. Also through the preliminary concept planning process, this is a graphic that staff prepared and was sharing throughout the process about the timeline and kind of the lead time that goes into development. And for the most part, it is still accurate with the exception of the Metro decision to expand in this particular round is expedited. They're doing their ask in less than 6 years, and they're doing it in about a year versus a 2-year process. That's not normal, but the normal process is about a 2-year process. And then also, obviously, the annexation. We still do require voter-approved annexations. However, we do have Senate Bill 1573 that provides an option if you have 100% of the property owners asking for the annexation and it meets all the code criteria, that you don't have to go for a vote. So I believe the 6 months is still an accurate time frame. Certainly if there is more certainty to a developer that they could annex, that they could annex if they don't have to go to a vote, but the process time I think is still roughly the same. Yes.
And just to clarify, another criteria of that annexation is if a comp plan's already been completed
Yes.
for that area.
Yes. So under the Senate Bill 1573 criteria, it requires, and I don't have it ingrained in my memory, but it requires that it be consistent with a comprehensive plan and meet any local criteria. And I'll touch on that a little bit later.
Just a question on that real quick too, along those lines. But if the comp plan is done and the annexation criteria is done, and we can go into that later, at that point the landowners really can put a request together as long as 100% of them vote for it, and it's contiguous to the city, and force an annexation at that point.
If it meets all other applicable criteria,
Right.
And I'll touch on that a little bit here in a minute. But okay, so I've talked to you about UGB process. I've talked to you about Sherwood West. I want to pause here and see if you have any questions about those two things before we get into what it is that we're really here to talk about tonight.
One quick, so there's a slide farther on, and maybe I'm jumping ahead, but you have little yellow dots in it. Does that represent, it's on page, I'm getting to the Sherwood West concept planning, 23. I know I jumped ahead, but it's actually a question about your process.
Yeah, I'll talk about that.
Yeah, I was just curious what those dots meant.
I will explain
Yes.
that. I will make sure
Okay.
that we talk about that. Carrie and Erica, have I missed anything that you wanted to make sure that we talked about?
I just had a quick
Yeah.
question. Back on the community engagement events slide, number 8, talking about all the outreach that you did. There were 3 community surveys that were done. Can you maybe give a quick overview of what those were? Those were run by the city, right? The city did those.
And they weren't, actually, I know Councilor Rosner was asking because I was thinking they were polls, but they really weren't polls. They're what you traditionally see in an open house, kind of what do you like about this plan? What do you not like? They were more public input surveys through the planning process.
Those that attended?
And they were online, so we had sort of a virtual open house type of scenario as well, so they were available online. And I know you were looking for more detail. I don't know if we got sidetracked.
Yeah, I was looking for them in the shared drive, and there's a lot of copies of the comments available that we could share that people commented on. I didn't have an exact count of how many I saw, though.
And another quick question. So during that period, what kind of discussions did we have with the school system about them being prepared? I know back then we didn't think it would happen this fast in terms of the potentials of Senate Bill 1573, but what kind of conversations were occurring? Were they involved? Because they didn't include that in their planning for the bond.
Right, and I can honestly say I was not the staff person in charge of this project, so I was not at all of the meetings, but I know that they were. They were on the Citizen Advisory Committee. I believe we had at least one, if not 2 members from the school district being part of those conversations, and they did provide input which helped, again, shape and guide the number of schools and the types of schools that were envisioned at that time. Again, we started that in 2014. I don't believe the school district had determined that they needed to do a bond until 2016, 2017. So they were involved, but I don't know whether, I guess I don't know what they knew.
Yeah, and I know we've talked about this
Yeah.
before, but one of the reasons I asked that question is because when you look at their bond application and all the work they did for that, they intentionally left Sherwood West out of their planning for student population.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and we've talked about that, and that does not seem shocking. And the reason why is when they were doing their planning and they're asking staff what's on the horizon over the 10-year period, especially when they were asking, I could honestly say within 10 years, I do not expect any development in Sherwood West, regardless of whether or not it's part of the urban growth boundary. And I still believe that. I know that there is different opinions, but so I think that they weren't wrong in not including that. I think there might be a little bit of a gray area in terms of when potential development could happen within that 10-year period, but I don't think it's going to be exponential.
Sorry, I didn't want
That's
to
okay.
hold you up.
Any other questions before I move on to the urban growth boundary decision? Okay. And I'm sorry, I'm not paying attention to you. Okay, so as a reminder, please don't.
I'll wait for you.
As a reminder, this is the urban reserves, and every 5 years, essentially, Metro is required to do an urban growth report or every 6 years, Metro is required to evaluate the capacity within the Portland metropolitan boundary to ensure that they are continually providing or accommodating a 20-year supply of land. So they do the urban growth report. They look at the buildable land within the existing urban growth boundary, the zoning, what the capacity is, and what the projections are for growth, and determine whether or not they have enough capacity to meet that need. If they determine that there is a deficit, that there isn't enough capacity to meet the need, then they need to determine how they're going to do that. That is often a urban growth boundary expansion. So they'll look at what our need is and how much land do we need to bring into the urban growth boundary to accommodate that need. And then, as I mentioned before, they normally do this every 6 years, but because when they did that last, they determined there was no need, and there was a lot of pushback given that we were coming out of the recession, and people thought that wasn't really a good measure, for projection and growth. They committed to look again in 3 years, and that's why we're doing that in 2018. So they, as I mentioned, they have a very expedited timeline. At the end of 2017, they wanted letters of interest from jurisdictions that were interested in urban growth boundary expansions. They received 5, totaling a little over 3,000 acres, I believe. All of them in Washington County, except Wilsonville. Actually, their portion is in Clackamas County. In May, cities are required to submit full proposals. In June, Metro is going to release their urban growth report with an analysis of the existing urban growth boundary, growth trends, and expansion options. And then in fall, they will be releasing a draft decision or draft recommendation, and then they will be making a final decision by the end of 2018 on whether or not, or whether and where to expand the urban growth boundary. There's been a lot of questions about what the next options are. The next legally mandated look would be 2024. That's where they look at the whole region, they do their urban growth report, they look at the need, they look at the capacity, and they determine whether or not there is a need to expand the urban growth boundary. As I mentioned earlier, there's now a mid-cycle option that would potentially be available in 2021 for jurisdictions to ask. They're not required to do this, and it's really going to be, and this is actually, Carrie said, it's directly from the Metro website. It would allow Metro Council to help cities that had a stars or aligned opportunity for new housing. I know, for new housing developments. And basically it's, we've got this specific need, we've got this specific opportunity, and we're asking for a very modest amount. The rules essentially say 900 acres total, so it's not one area could get 900 acres. That's the most that they could potentially expand is 900 acres. Go ahead.
And when in 2011, when they expanded it, was it 2011? They did 2,000 acres back then
I believe that, yes,
for the urban reserves.
in the urban
Or
reserves.
in your okay.
Yeah, it went into the urban reserves. They expanded it by about 2,000 acres.
Okay, thank you.
And that was based on the urban growth report and need. So this new 3-year mid-cycle has never been done before, so we don't know what that will look like exactly.
It could all change in 3 years too.
It could all change.
Yeah. Do we have any indication on how much land Metro is considering for this ask total? Because 3,000 is a lot compared to some of the previous years. It sounds like.
Well, it depends on who you ask whether or not it's a lot. I don't know. We'll all know together. I guess just as looking back, what was it, 2002, they expanded it by 18,000 acres. So depends on the projections and the capacity and stuff. I don't expect 18, I don't expect that. So this is obviously summarizing a lot of information in a very nice little nutshell. But why are we considering expansion? One of the big answers is we know it takes a long time to plan and see development. Brookman was brought in 2002. It's still not developing. Tonkin Employment Area was brought in 2004. It's still not developing. Area 59, which is the area around the Ridges schools, was brought in 2004, primarily for the schools. It was annexed at the same time that the schools came in. The school built the roads and the infrastructure and formed a reimbursement district. And yes, we've seen some development happening there, but it's really just been within the past several years that we've started seeing any development in there. Again, that was brought in 2002. So it takes time, is the point. Historic growth rates predict that we could be out of developable land within 4 to 10 years. I know later on tonight you're going to be talking about the housing needs analysis, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But we do have a current identified deficit that is based on a very low growth rate of 0.8% growth. And if we grow at our historic rates, we will be out of land much sooner, and that includes development of Brookman, which hasn't developed.
It depends on how far back you go in historical, because we were a dead community for decades.
True. That is true.
Yeah, and I had
We
a
had a
question.
growth spurt in the 90s.
Yeah.
And I have a question about that because, like, for instance, in the 90s, as Keith just brought up, we had lots of supplies. So we had lots of dirt that was ready to be developed, and we had a great economy, and we tripled the size of the city, 380% in 10 years, right? So right now we have less supply. So even in a great economic cycle, the last 10 years we're only growing at, as we come out of the recession, at 1%. So how are they trying to read tea leaves in terms of we're going to have an economic downturn, or because we're right at the peak right now? I would expect we're probably going to have a cooling off period here shortly. But I think in the Metro had about 1%, 0.8%. But
0.8%.
when you say 4 to 10 years, is that 3%, 4%?
That was, what was that based on?
So that's so the last, from 2014, we were growing about 3.4%. So that would be 10 years. Our overall growth rate between 1990 and 2017, I believe, was about 8%, which would be the 4 years.
Heavily skewed by the 90s for sure. But
Correct.
Okay, so in the 2000 to 2014 gets a little skewed because we were at one point during there we were adding, I think, 575 homes in 1 year. We were seeing a lot of growth during that time frame as well. So I'm just trying to understand how we get to that forecast going forward. So
It's in my opinion, it's a little bit of a wild ass guess. With some education in there, but if you have the supply, we're a very attractive community. We'll grow.
yeah, and if you don't have the supply, even in a great economic cycle, you're going to grow slowly, I would assume. So
Well, if you don't have the supply, and I guess that's the next bullet point. What happens if you don't have the supply? You see increased home prices, lack of attainable housing for differing income levels. you're more likely at the council level to see pressure to upzone and rezone. Yes, that does not mean you have to, but there will be more and more pressure to do so. You're also likely to see more tear down of like older homes on larger lots and infilling. We've seen that. That's sort of the example. The Main Street subdivision was an example of that. You're likely just to see more infill in general. And then just fewer choices, meaning if you want to move out of your home into a smaller home, you might have less options because there's just less availability to you. Less options for people to come into the community, fewer choices of types of housing. So there's, that is the consequence of having less available land to grow into. And then we're also considering an expansion at this time because Metro is considering expansion at this time. If they weren't doing this again for 3 years, we wouldn't be talking about this and we would be having this conversation in 3 years. But because they're doing this now, I don't believe that in 3 years, we will have the same opportunity to ask for the same type and amount, and we may not have a valid argument at all because we don't have, if we can't justify the need based on our specific circumstance and the opportunity based on our specific circumstance, I don't know that Metro would consider an ask in the 3-year mid-cycle review process, but we don't know.
So
I have
what's,
a quick. Sorry.
Go ahead, please.
no, go ahead.
Question on the infill, because I hear a lot about that. If we don't grow up, we're going to grow up. If we
Right.
don't grow out, we're going to grow up.
Right.
Or tear down old homes and build more. There are things we can do in our zoning and to eliminate that from being able to happen, right? I mean,
Well, to a certain extent. I mean, if you've got zoned capacity, you're allowed to subdivide to the minimum lot size. You're allowed to build to the minimum densities. And so if they have the ability to do that, they could. I don't think there's, I can't think of any examples here specifically, but other places that before they had minimum density requirements, they might have seen development of high density residential land developed at single family lots. And so those are types of things. Maybe there's situations where people developed at lower densities than they needed to, and they could actually higher
go up.
density.
Okay.
But couldn't we, we think we have about 175 acres of developable land within the city limits in the current UGB.
Yeah, I don't have it ingrained in my brain.
So, in terms of how we look at our zoning and planning as we go through this comp plan effort, couldn't we move from like density-based to more form-based zoning rules and, make changes like requiring a higher percentage of green space in community areas and linear trails and to connect? I have to believe there's some things we could do, although not perfect, to your point, that could control that infill and at least make it compatible with our community. I would also think that we can do some things to solve some of the problems you talk about in terms of middle housing and affordable housing with that existing land. Isn't there an opportunity to do that too?
Sure, there's some opportunities, but not unlimited opportunities.
Sure.
So did you guys want to add anything on that? Okay. Okay, so we have a vision for Sherwood West. We have discussed that we believe that there is a need. Our housing needs analysis identifies that there is a deficit for about a little under 500 dwelling units. So we know there is a 20-year need. There was the opportunity for Metro to do an ask, and so we wanted to go out to the public and especially the Sherwood West area and say, well, where do you think, if we were to ask, do you think we should ask? So on October 25th of 2017, we had an open house. We provided Facebook notice, Twitter notice. We advertised it on the website. We did mailed notice to property owners within the area, as well as e-notice to our Sherwood West and comp plan interested parties list. We had 85 people in attendance and received 67 written comments. And what we heard, and this is the yellow pins on this map essentially represent property owners that were interested in being brought into the urban growth boundary and anticipated development within a sooner time frame, right?
Yeah, so the yellow represents comments that we received in support of those particular areas being brought in. Some were from property owners, some might have been from citizens. Yeah, the yellow represents the 2018 decision. You might be able to point out some pins in there that were for a future decision, maybe 2021 or 2024.
So the red pins are essentially saying people were interested, but not quite yet. They thought that it should be asked later.
Is it fair to say, I'm just trying to understand the numbers, if we had 85 people attend and 67 written comments, were most of those coming from landowners in that area?
I don't think so.
There was a variety. I mean, we didn't have a form on the box to check on the form if there were a landowner or a citizen. There were a mix from whatever.
And we do have those all on our website. If you go to the Sherwood West page, you can read all 67 comments. And I believe that you also did a summary, you summarized them.
Yeah.
So what we heard in terms of support, I guess, is that growth should be focused around the new high school, that it should be focused in areas most readily served by infrastructure. As you can tell, just even from the pins on the map, there was more interest in areas, the phases A, B, and portions of C being brought in. There was a lot of concern, though, of whatever comes in, however it comes in, we need to deal with the transportation system. And to that, I'll say, really, the best way to deal with transportation is to have development that funds transportation. Not to say that that's the silver bullet, but you spur improvements. Improvements don't just happen without a funding mechanism to make them happen. And then there's also concern about the impact of Sherwood's growth and affecting the small town feel. And then I'll just remind you that really the whole purpose of the Sherwood West preliminary concept plan was to ensure that the area grows in a way that respects and complements that small town feel. And if we move forward planning, doing it right, we will make sure that that happens.
Was industrial or commercial land discussed beyond just the kind of the the commercial areas to serve? You know, because we do have a limited supply. You know, when you look at our geography, it's either west or east toward Wilsonville or west toward Hillsborough. Was that discussed during the concept planning about setting aside some of the Sherwood West for that?
I'm honestly not certain if industrial land was discussed in any detail. I believe that commercial was, and it was really determined that the amount of commercial being provided was serving the residents in that area, and was really desired to be that small scale residential or small scale commercial, with the exception of that gateway to the wine country. That doesn't mean, and I know you and I have talked about that, that doesn't mean that as we go into the planning, we can't explore things, you know, in terms of what different makeup of uses makes sense. I know that when we were years ago, when we were talking about the urban reserves initially, there was a vision that northern area, not included in the letter of interest ask, but that northern area potentially be employment land.
Under the power lines,
under the power
no one
lines.
wants to live anyways, right?
But through the Sherwood West preliminary concept plan process, it was really more identified for schools and parks and things like that. So that, again, that doesn't mean that as we move forward in the future that can't be a conversation, but I don't believe it was a robust conversation through the concept planning process. So that's what we heard. And we prepared a letter of interest based on the input that we received. We went to council at a work session with our recommendation. Initially, originally, we were thinking that we were going to recommend 300 acres. And so that was really kind of where we were focused on. But after hearing from the public and considering, we also had the high school that was coming in, and we were looking at the infrastructure costs associated with just bringing in an 80-acre high school site. And it really became apparent to us that there was potential that we could do more in terms of infrastructure, meeting those needs that the community wants to be met if we brought in more rooftops that would help share those costs than if we brought in 100 rooftops. And so that, combined with the input that we received led to our recommendation of about how many acres initially was our recommendation? Yeah, 560, that sounds right. We'll say that's accurate. And then at the work session, we did get some modifications. Basically, we discussed including that eastern portion, that's sort of the southern portion of that E area that was identified as hillside residential, so that we could better or more likely provide funding opportunities for that north-south road. That if we brought in both sides of the road, we'd have more opportunities to fund that. So we did modify the recommendation based on council's input. And then after the council meeting, we also heard from some citizens that made us realize that we really hadn't considered the topography of the area as accurately as we had hoped. And so like we had actually cut a property off, and there was some creek issues that made us go, okay, we need to actually modify that a little bit more. So what you see there is the area that we included in our letter of interest. And again, the only difference between those two pictures is what is happening with Elwert. And so that area in our letter of interest was 626 acres. And okay, before I go on to the analysis, I'm going to give you my caveats. So here's my caveat slide. I'm like, I can't tell. So it's important to keep in mind that when we did the Sherwood West preliminary concept plan, we didn't have any zoning. We specifically did not identify zoning. We really wanted to paint a picture, sort of give the gist of the types of uses and the kind of what we envisioned for development without having densities and without having zoning assigned. We knew that that was going to come later, but we really wanted to have a picture. So we didn't have anything to base that off of. So going into the analysis, initially in our letter of interest, we said 10 to 12 units per acre. But as we started to look at what really could happen based on that vision, we actually modified that down more to about 8.5 homes per acre. But it varies based on the different hillside residential versus neighborhood, things like that. Those assumptions that we made based on the descriptions from the concept plan informed our SDC estimates, dwelling unit numbers, commercial square footage numbers, as well as tax revenue estimates. And so keep in mind that this all could change. The capital costs are really based on a high level, best professional judgment. Bob is a rock star, just spends, time at night staying up, calculating numbers. But it's just based on very high level information.
Bob, are you getting overtime for your? Okay, just checking. So we know that the details are going to be refined, and these estimates are really only to provide comparative analysis. So with those caveats, the area in our letter of interest, we believe would provide about 3,700 dwelling units and about 97,500 square feet of commercial space. With those assumptions, it would bring in about almost $22 million annually in taxes to all taxing districts. And I've got a slide a little bit later that goes into kind of the ones that I think you guys care most about. And then we estimate about $110 million in SDC revenues that would go towards funding road improvements, parks, sanitary, storm, that kind of stuff. And this shows you the capital costs that we anticipate for that area in our letter of interest. On the low end, it's about $113 million. On the high end, it's about $160 million. Again, the big difference is what happens with Elwert. Just for a comment, to be clear, it's a county road.
Yes.
The county owns it, they control it, they do what they want with it, they tell us what they want with it.
Yes.
Unless you persuade them to do something differently.
To a certain extent, yes. That doesn't mean that if we were to plan and develop this area going through concept planning or zoning, and we'd need to meet transportation planning rule, we need to identify how these things would be funded, and they would make sure that we have identified funding. We may say a lot of that's going to be MISTIP and a lot of it's, but that yes.
Right, but again, it's the county road, the
Yes.
county gets to dictate what they want to do, and we can urge them to do something, but
That is true. Okay, so that is the letter of interest area. And now alternatives. So we knew that there was some desire to look at smaller areas, so we came up with two scenarios. One is what we're referring to as alternative A. I also refer to it as the south of the high school, although, yeah, Councilor Rosner says it's south and east of the high school. So that, basically what that is from Chapman north to Haiti, and then, the width of the urban reserve area. That would be 295 net developable acres, about 2,800 dwelling units, about 86,500 square feet of commercial, and that would bring in almost $18 million in taxes annually to all taxing districts, and $86 million in SDC revenues.
Question on that. So I know the kind of your guesses on zoning are an estimate, and believe me, I think I'm speaking for everyone. We all trust your best guesses. You guys are professionals, and we rely on that. So I totally trust you on that. But I'm trying to get a sense because Metro has an overall goal for new land being brought in that it's 50% high density, 50% low density. So when you look at that 2,800 number, is your guess we're going to be kind of in that we're looking at 50% like multifamily, duplexes, apartments, high density, and 50% traditional single family detached?
Yeah, let me go over, let's see if I can find it here. A nice big one. Oh. So if you look kind of the hillside residential, just because it's on the hillside, it's going to be, this is what's maybe why your numbers are changing. That's going to be around 4 dwelling units per acre because it's not super developable. The residential neighborhood will be a little higher. It could have a mix of housing types. The neighborhood mixed use will be a little more intense with more mixed housing types. So overall, there will be an opportunity. We're required to provide an opportunity for there to be a housing split of 50% multifamily and 50% single family.
Okay.
So, and I'm just looking at my assumption numbers, and yeah, it is right. It's close to 50-50, frankly. So, okay, and so 86 million, and then this actually costs a lot less. It's still expensive. Again, the big difference between option 1 and option 2 is Elwert Road and what happens there. And while this isn't near Elwert Road, our assumption is that whatever we do, because Edie Elwert has issues, that there's going to need to be something that happens there. And so we have included that cost in all 3 scenarios. So that's really the difference there. Moving on to alternative B, this is essentially what I'm referring to as the eastern portion. So what it excludes is the hillside residential. And unfortunately, while by excluding the hillside residential, it actually lowers the SDC revenue projections quite a bit. So it is fewer dwelling units, but it's also a lot less SDC revenue, a lot less tax revenue, still 97,500 square feet of commercial development space. And then next slide, though, you'll see it doesn't have a dramatic reduction compared to that alternative A scenario of the capital costs because you're still having to extend that infrastructure that full length versus having it a little bit more compact. So this slide shows you the capital cost comparisons just so you could see it quickly and easily. And then I wanted to, so before we talk about the gap, although I know you guys have all seen the PowerPoint presentation already, so I'm sort of giving everything away, but there are gaps in all scenarios between what we anticipate is going to be covered through system development charges and what those capital costs are. There are ways to fund that gap. One of the most likely is going to be through a supplemental SDC. So we have our citywide SDC. We could either raise all of the citywide SDCs, or we can keep the citywide SDCs where they're at and have a supplemental SDC if we needed to. You could also do local improvement districts. development agreements with the developers, the county, the state, federal funding, those types of things. Next slide. So this slide shows you the gap. You can actually see the smallest gap actually is identified in alternative A. Again, because we have higher SDC costs and just lower in general capital costs. Next slide. So I wanted to show you the tax revenue comparisons. You can see the difference in acres, the difference in dwelling units, the difference in population and commercial square footage. What I did to get those estimates is I essentially took newer development, because I wanted to kind of see what new development was being assessed at for single family, small lots, about 2,000 square foot lot, a single family, larger lot, a townhome, a condo, and then some commercial space. And so I applied those numbers to the assumptions that we made throughout that area, and that's where I got those estimates. They're not accurate. Don't expect that to be 100%. It's really just for comparison purposes. Next slide, though.
Quick question on that, on the school bonds, because they have is that just on the permanent rate? Because the $247 million bond would just get spread out across the additional homes. You wouldn't necessarily raise additional revenue, correct?
I don't know. That's a good question. So this slide, I think you jumped ahead, but this slide is showing you the tax revenues for the school district, Tualatin Valley Fire and Rescue, and then Sherwood. And I combined the Sherwood URA because I figure by the time this develops, the URA likely won't be, and so we wanted to see what those numbers were. And I'm not certain about the bond. That's a really good point, that may not actually be the revenue that's generated. It may spread it out, but you can see what the tax revenues would be separate from the bond revenues for the different alternatives.
Yeah, because traditionally school bonds are for construction and they get spread out.
Yeah, you're right.
So Julia, just a quick time for the mayor and council. You're getting close to your 7 o'clock start. I'm assuming you're going to want to, my recommendation is just continue with this work session, and you'll start your regular meeting late, and we can kind of check in about 7:30 and see where we are. Is that okay?
Yes.
And we are almost done with the presentation, but then there will likely be discussion.
We're fine with that.
Okay, thank you.
So
back on the taxes, I apologize. So on the taxes that would come to the city, so the 3 million, 9, the 3.2, or the 1.8, I think it's important to mention, and I know there's some question about where this number originally came from, but traditionally, when you take $1 of revenue in from residential property, it costs the city about $1.25 to service that, versus commercial and industrial, which are actually, you make money on commercial, you lose money on residential, I guess is the way to put it. So even though, yes, it's going to bring in a potentially, $4 million in revenue on that $1.25 rule, could create a $1 million hole in our budget in terms of trying to service that area. I think that's important for people to understand.
yeah, it is, but I want to know where that number came from and whether or not it's still accurate, in part because I also know that there's been a lot of discussion about smart growth and the concept that the more sort of compact and urban you develop, the less it costs to provide those services. And so I don't know that if that number is a one-size-fits-all or if that number is unique to the Portland metropolitan area. So I would love to do some more research on what that is.
Well, and I think where I'm going with that, it is a rule of thumb that's been around for decades. But part of this planning, we didn't do that detailed study of what the impact on our tax base is going to be. And with our general fund already very, very tight, we have fewer police officers per 10,000 population than all the cities around us. It's just, I think, something we have to be really careful about and understand. That's why I'm bringing it up.
Yes, and I also, I guess, keeping in mind, and that's why I wanted to show that it's not just the city. There's other tax revenues, and again, there are other. I didn't think you cared about what Metro gets or PCC or TriMet. So I didn't put those on there, but I've got those numbers.
The enthusiasm across the dice is just not there.
So I know a big question that I hear, the concern about growth and uncontrolled growth, and how do we control it through careful planning. And we believe that through the planning phase, through the concept planning, comprehensive planning phase, that we can really address that, and that we will need to address that. Ensure that we've discussed phasing, that maybe we have overlay and design standards, annexation criteria, discuss funding criteria, maybe require financial impact analysis before annexation, those types of things. And I know Senate Bill 1573 is new, but it also requires that that development that it comply with local plans and codes. And so I believe that we can have criteria if we want to. And I do have examples just of some other codes. I just did some internet searching. I don't necessarily expect you guys to read it in detail, but there are other cities that have annexation criteria, some much more detailed than others. Some, like Tiger, just has a criteria that says it's in the best interest of the city. Josh agrees that that's probably a little open-ended for a 1573 standard. But Hillsborough actually has, they're like the last 2.5 pages, 3 pages of this. And they actually have, I'm sorry, I'll give this to you. They have criteria that in certain areas that they comply, I'm not going to say the right area, but in certain areas that you have an annexation agreement and that you have a developer agreement, and that you comply with that overlay standard. So I think that there are things that we could do through the planning process that would help ensure that we get the growth in the time that is of concern to us.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think my concern around that is, this is a relatively new law, that I think was passed in 2016, and it just hasn't been tested in court yet. We don't really know, how the dominoes are going to fall. If we start to use annexation ordinances to control growth and someone decides they don't like what we're doing, I think there is some risk there, and I think there's more dominoes to fall in how all that kind of pans out, for the community.
Yeah, and to that, I'll say that you're right. Absolutely, it hasn't been tested. The jurisdictions that I mentioned don't have voter-approved annexation, so those are the criteria that they have to apply regardless, and they haven't been challenged to the best of my knowledge. So they're standards that are out there that are applicable to annexations.
That's true, but Senate Bill 1573 also took the power of the council away. I mean, prior to that, the council or the voters could say no. Now, as long as they meet all that criteria and it hasn't been challenged in the courts, and kind of that scenario that we talked about, the council has no say and the voter has no say on the timing of that. That's the only point I'm trying to bring up.
And I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, or if that's.
I think you covered it.
Okay. All right. So next, just getting close to the end, but so again, just reminding you, I'm not going to dwell on this, but the timeline in our judgment, we think it's going to be a minimum of 6 years, more likely 10 years before you see really any significant development of any kind, and that this would really be providing a 20-plus year land supply. Next slide is next steps in council decisions. So this evening, you actually have your first reading on the housing needs analysis and comprehensive plan text. There would be a second reading April 3rd. That would need to be adopted and acknowledged before you could do an ask for this 2018 UGB decision. May 2nd, we will be bringing forward a resolution basically accepting the refinement of the Sherwood West refinement plan, essentially taking the Sherwood West concept plan and refining it to whatever area it is that we ultimately decide, if we decide to include in an ask. And I was asked earlier whether or not we could do that sooner, and not really, because we're kind of waiting to see what direction we get to finish writing that. So we just need time to prepare that. There would be a resolution supporting the UGB expansion proposal, again, if there is one, that on May 2nd, as well as an IGA with Washington County discussing kind of the urban service provision, which is another requirement of the UGB ask. Metro will be making their preliminary decision in September and a final decision in December. And then sort of to leave you to ponder, no, that's fine. So the last slide is really, we really want direction and discussion, but this is sort of a pondering slide. Go back to that one. So we could look at all three alternatives that we're discussing. One is the letter of interest area, and then alternative A, alternative B. So you can kind of look at them all and discuss.
Hey, Julia, how close is alternative A's size to what the council, the city asked for 10 years ago, whenever that was?
It's pretty darn close. I believe it was like 276 acres then.
Oh, so it's only like 10 acres, 12 acres off, something like that? 2011? Okay.
Rounding, it's 10 years.
Yeah.
Kim, go ahead.
Yeah, inflation brought in a few more acres.
I just had a question. Since we're going to talk about the housing needs analysis later, but when we use the 0.8% that Metro determined that's what our growth would be, when in actuality we know it's somewhere between 3.4 and 8%, probably closer to 3.4. Did we come up with any sort of figure that what we might think our deficit would be in that 20 years besides the 497?
No,
Based on
we didn't come
more
up with
realistic.
this.
And I can tell you why, because we actually discussed that in 2015 when we drafted this for the Sherwood West preliminary concept plan. We're required to use the Metro numbers, and so we wouldn't have a valid housing needs analysis if we used different numbers.
But I'm saying use Metros in that, but just for our purposes, realistically, do we think our deficit's more of closer to 1,000?
And we didn't run those. We
Okay.
basically asked them, if we grew at the rates we grew, how far would we be out of land? That isn't really
4 to
required.
10, okay.
Right, that aspect isn't required in a housing needs analysis, but that is essentially reflecting what you're asking, essentially.
Right, but the way I think about it is if the supply's there and the economy's good, it's going to grow fast, just like it did in the 1990s. If the supply's not there or the economy's not bad or some combination, you have to have supply. So, so that's where I get concerned about those 3 to 4%, given where our supply is today.
Well, I'd like to tag on to what you're saying there, and that is under the slide about how we control growth, there's a question about phasing. So if land is brought into the UGB, can we control that phasing even after a 2.5 year, 3 year planning period? What do you mean by phasing? Okay.
Potentially, depending on how we plan it, how we develop annexation criteria. So I don't have an answer for you. I think that there would be some natural phasing, but I don't know.
So what definition are you using then for that particular option on that same page that Councilor Kuiper's talking about? When it says development of comprehensive plan and zoning for this area, phasing, what are you using?
Just discussing kind of whether or not you could talk about phasing.
Okay.
Thank you, Mayor. My position on this is kind of clear. I'm certainly an advocate of pausing. We did a certain level of outreach. We certainly got the property owners of Sherwood West on board with what we might do. In my communicating with folks in the community and organizations in the community, we still haven't sold it. We went through, as we know, several years of more than 15 years of voter-approved annexation. The first 8 or 10 of them all got approved, no big deal, and then Brookman rolled in, and everybody said, "Ooh, no," because of concerns with schools and crowding and what might be in their backyard, the NIMBY scenario. I got voted down 3 times, and then the power was taken away from the voters, and with the state changing that, and that kind of built in a pretty deep-seated anger in different parts of the community. So for me, the value of going beyond, I'm not going to fault staff for what they've done in the past of developing concepts, but it wasn't enough. The school district and people in the school district, if you talk to anybody, they're all saying, wait, please wait, and that's our most important partner. I know we listed the chamber on there. I've been on the chamber board the last 5 years, president 1 year, and I don't remember us, having a real big deep dive as a chamber, talking about this. So for me, we allocated this big bucket of money that we are getting in part from selling land to the school district to do the comprehensive plan update and hopefully do a big outreach again to say, what does the community want when we grow up, to adding 5,000 or whatever the number is to the population. I personally feel we need to redouble our efforts to get buy-in and know what they want and look at 2021, even though, yeah, the rules are different. The rules are always different with Metro. They're always going to be different, and sometimes they're going to get worse or better, and it's all about the itch of who's elected up there. We've come, and I'm just saying we as the collective we, not putting it anyone because most of them aren't here, but we've come from the last few years of, fighting internally with the police department, and creating havoc with them and possibly contracting out services, created morale problems with PD, I believe led to some folks retiring when they wouldn't have retired or left to do other jurisdictions if we didn't have that craziness happen. We fought with the YMCA for no good reason and had that angst and stuff that we all witnessed. And now we've got our largest partner, the school district, who you talk to, teachers, board members, administrators, parents, they're all saying, please wait, because they're not sold on this.
Hey, Keith, has the city received an official letter to that effect?
No.
Well, then we don't really know what the official
Right.
status of the school board is, do we?
And
I mean, did I miss something? Did we not? Oh,
They have not.
okay.
And to that end, what I've been suggesting, and I know at least a couple of people up here are in agreement, is having a work session with our partner, the school district, and with possibly the land developers. Ideally, I'd like everybody to be a part of that conversation all together in one room. But if that can't happen, I would like to see a conversation, a work session with the school district, and then a work session with the developers.
Because you're right, in the last at least 5 years, there hasn't been a joint city council school board meeting dinner like we did in the past. I think there's value in
Yeah, I think that's a great
having
idea.
those conversations.
That's a good idea.
Well,
So, certainly the landowners are eager and wanting to do this. When I went door to door with our campaign, I chatted with a lot of folks, and a lot of folks, aren't sold on it by any stretch of the imagination. I did talk to a handful that said yes, they're in support, and it was either they're affiliated with the company developing the land. One was an Elk member that was worried about a delay in trying to get sewer service to the Elk property. Another didn't care because they weren't going to vote for another school bond regardless, and their kids weren't going to Sherwood Public Schools. And a fourth that didn't care as they were leaving in 5 years regardless. They were going to move. That was the scope of the angst in support, quasi, of doing something now. It is true that you do not know if phasing is possible. You do not know if construction would start in 4 years or 10 years. More importantly, you don't know if Metro is really going to support this. I think the odds are less than 50-50 that Metro would even support Sherwood's ask. From a process standpoint, Sherwood could advance something, and then it becomes a beauty contest at Metro. And so you'll have up to 5 asks from the region, and then it's go sell it. Go sell your story to Metro and see if they support what you want to do. And it's which community is meeting their goals and standards the most and meeting the criteria they have for this ask. And you can talk to 10 regional leaders and get 10 different answers on what they think the odds are. Everything from, I've had people tell me they were surprised Sherwood sent the letter just because of our history with Brookman and annexation, to folks say, we got to do it even if you don't get the ask because you need to fight Metro. But if you take a realistic ask of where are your 4 votes at Metro if you send an ask? I think you got Craig Dirksen. I think Craig Dirksen's going to support anything from Washington County. I think if Catherine Harrington makes it past the May primary, she'll support for the most part. If she doesn't, she'll probably go into partisan politics and make whatever decision she wants. Tom Hughes, he's lame duck. I don't know what his position would be. So I don't know if he could get 4 votes to support a request from Sherwood. I really don't. So if you've got your finger in the air and you don't think that you could even get the support of Metro, if you send a request, then you're creating angst in your community with your largest partner. And them, from what I hear off the record officially from teachers, the full scope of folks plus families of saying just wait and let's get a better feel of what we want to do, and then roll the dice with whatever the rules are by Metro in 2021, 2024, and go by that. The biggest point of control you have as a council is the decision if you send a request or not to Metro. You do have things you do after the fact, but unless you have a good plan, make sure we have partners on board. We sell it if there's an ask that we want to do. Let's sell it before we ask instead of after we ask, so that when you knock on a door on families that live across Elbert, they're not going, hell no, please don't. Like folks that answered the door when I knocked on it. So.
Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mayor-elect. Wanted to tag on to what's something that Mayor-elect May said, which was about Brookman. How many acres is Brookman? Do you remember?
Hold on.
Is it like 323? That sticks in my head. Is it something like that?
Brookman is actually 235 acres.
235, okay. And 98 acres of it right now has been asked to be brought in. And that's just to be brought into the city limits.
Correct.
Right? And I don't know whether or not there's been any movement to do any development there or not. But we have another, whatever the 200 and some acres minus the 98 acres would be remaining, 150 plus or whatever it is. Oh, my math is terrible, less than that. Anyway, that is sitting there in the urban growth boundary that has not yet even been annexed, right? And do we have any indication of whether property owners in Brookman Road have considered requesting annexation right now? Do we know?
Well, certainly some of them have. I know, have we talked to people recently in addition to?
We had for the people that have annexed, we received a pre-application.
Who have annexed? Okay.
To
The 98
put out
acres.
putting out general feelers about what can be developed. A lot of it is dependent on the sewer line.
Oh,
It
okay.
can't be developed until the
The
sewer
sewer
line
line?
is available to them.
And when would that happen?
So that is actually, Clean Water Services is, and it's actually related to the school as well, but they are putting into their CIP for design 2000, give me a date.
Sorry, I'm trying to make some calculations in my head here.
Right now, Clean Water Services has the project listed on the 5-year CIP. What they're looking at is budgeting the negotiations to get it budgeted through their commission beginning next fiscal year, for design.
For design.
That'll take about 1.5 years to go through the design and any type of easements that we'll need to get land acquisitions for the alignment to get completed. After that, it would probably take 2.5 years to complete construction, to go through the bidding process and get construction completed and up and running. So
2.5 years
we're
to complete construction on a sewer line that the
Yes.
rest of Brookman folks
we
might be waiting on?
Yes, and
before they ask for an
they sort of
annexation?
have committed to have it online so the school district could actually use it about a year after the school opens. And so the school is actually looking at doing a temporary
That's why.
private
Okay.
sewer lift
Yes.
thing.
I remember that. Okay. So when the school district made its calculations, they included Brookman Road?
I'm sorry, what?
When school district made its calculations for population, they included Brookman Road?
They did include Brookman. I believe they included it fully built
Okay.
out.
Thank you. The entire 323 or 220 acres? 200?
I believe so, but I'm not.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. Just to kind of go along the lines, you were asking a question, Russell, about whether the schools have formally said yay or nay to this. I think that's a two-way street. Kind of echo what Keith talked about. They're a significant partner of ours. And, just to kind of step back, I find it astonishing. If you look at how our state manages school construction and funding and land use, it's completely disconnected, right? There's very little coupling that goes on. If you go to Washington State and put a big subdivision in, they in essence put SDCs on that subdivision to pay for future schools, so the schools can bank that. So as you build out, your schools can track, right? In Oregon, we don't have that. So, and it's too bad over the last 5 to 6 years we haven't had that strong partnership with the school system. I think that's part of the reason they didn't weigh in earlier. I'm just guessing on that, but I think it's part of our job to make sure we're looking at that as we make these decisions. I did, because I think it's hard for the school to talk right now, because I think partly because of the litigation they're in, but I went back and just looked at their school population forecasts that they put together in 2015, their 10-year forecast, which includes, they're looking at adding 1,000 students by 2025. Okay, and that's without Sherwood West. Right now, they're almost at capacity in the school system. The new bond measure adds 2,000 seats to the school, so they've already used up half of it by the time of that new capacity by the time we get to 2025 or so. So if we do this ask, and say in 6 years we start to see development, even at a rate of slower than what we saw earlier, around 2000, it may be 200 to 300, homes per year. We saw rates as high as 500 homes per year. They could potentially be out of space in the schools again by between 2025 and 2027, based on my math, right? And if you think about the 4-year lead time they need for a bond, to build a new high school and probably a couple more grade schools, they're probably looking at having to go out for a bond in 2021 to 2023. We just passed a bond in 2016. So I for the purposes of partnering with our schools and making sure we really understand the impact this is going to have, I kind of agree with Keith. I think we need to pause. But we don't pause and do nothing, right? We have to pause and say, okay, we need to finish our comprehensive plan. I would really push that we do a overall visioning, community visioning process across the whole city and all the services. So, how does a comprehensive plan work with our economic development plan and our cultural arts plan and all that? A strategic plan for the city so we can execute on that and have a comprehensive plan rolling right behind that. So I know it's kind of changing the order of things, but I think we have an opportunity here to really get it right. And I worry that if we move forward at this point without that partnership with the schools, especially, that we're going to create a hardship for them.
I think we should try and schedule a joint meeting with them as soon as possible. If they will. I know it's maybe a delicate time for them, but this is an important, I was thinking about that quote, whoever put the stars aligned quote, it's brought off of Metro's website. And I think, what's kind of causing this whole thing is they took this big blue square and they put it outside of the UGB into Sherwood West. We went through that comprehensive plan process all those years ago. It was a small school here, a small school there, maybe this will develop, maybe that'll develop. Well, that's a high school. It's 90 acres of high school. It's not a small use, it's a huge use. And they're putting it just outside of the city, soon to be in the city. Well, it's in the city, but So my point is, it's kind of the catalyst that's causing all of this. So that's one of the stars that's aligning right here. So what I want to do is I want to hear from them. I want to hear from their mouths. What maybe in a more private setting, I don't know, but I like to have a conversation with them and get it from them and their experts, not through a second source, and find out how they really feel about it. Because what I don't want to do is I don't want us to miss this stars aligned opportunity. Maybe this is a good opportunity. Maybe we should ask for something smaller. I don't know yet, but I wouldn't mind having a conversation with, extending this conversation, like Renee suggested, maybe meeting with them. I don't know, something like that.
So timing wise, actually, next, if you can go to the next slide. So we do need direction, and you're not making a decision this evening,
Right.
but we do have work that needs to be done if we're going to put an ask together, and we really need to get some direction. We certainly can move forward with a general direction and still allow opportunities for you to get input and ultimately on May 2nd make a yay or nay decision. But it would be really nice if we can get some direction to help staff know what it is that we're writing or not writing.
So to that point, I think that tonight we've been talking a lot of a very binary decision, yes or no, move
Right.
forward or not. Does anybody have any thoughts on the smaller asks, the alternative A, alternative B? We haven't really discussed those at all.
And I can tell, just based on the numbers, if you haven't asked me, but if you were to ask me, I would recommend against alternative B simply because of the funding gap.
Can we discuss that here? I mean, if we were to narrow one down, that was the first thought I had as well. That didn't look as appealing. So can we kind of
Just
narrow
for
our
what I
choices?
was, when I was looking through and making some notes, it seems like the A alternative is actually a really good way to go, being that we could potentially work with the school, talk with them a little bit about it. I've had conversations with a couple of school board members, and I did not get as complete of a halt as has been indicated earlier in the meeting. So I think that having a group partnering conversation would be a great idea. I think it's what Councilor Bross said is a great idea. But I do think a smaller ask, starting with alternative A and seeing where that goes, and in conversation with our stakeholders and partnering is a really good alternative.
I would agree with alternative A as well. And we're talking about the spirit of partnership. Partnerships go both ways. So yes, we need to hear from our school district, but they also need to understand the whole interest of the city as well. So if we look at partnership, I want us to keep that in mind.
And my concern on saying no right now on moving forward is, then where does that leave us? That leaves us with a high school in the middle of a field. And that's not, I don't think that works well for everybody. So, I'm certainly leaning towards the alternative A as well. I'm not interested in alternative B just based on the numbers.
Is there an opportunity to do something smaller than that? I mean, because the difference in acreage, we're down to basically, if you look at the overall acres developable, not developable, a third of the urban reserves versus half of the urban reserves. Because, in the math I did on the school population, even this with 2,800 homes, that's roughly 1,600 more students, and it doesn't take many years to pop us over that 95% capacity level with schools, so it.
So you mean like taking, say, the southern part of where the high school is and extending that southern boundary to the west?
Well, I'm just asking if it's even a possibility at this point, because it's.
No, we didn't. I mean, so we certainly could. The problem is that in order for us to proceed with writing that Title 11 concept plan and getting ready for a May 2nd decision by you, we need to have some general direction. And I don't know if taking, there's a sweet spot between homes and costs and SDCs. And so I think the more you take out in terms of homes, I don't think you're going to see a significant reduction in capital costs. So you're going to just have a larger funding gap. That doesn't mean it's not doable. It just makes it less doable.
And just to verify the funding gap on this one, I think it was on page, thank you, Mayor.
42.
Oh, Thank you. Where did it go? Here it is. Yes, 1.4 million to 44 million. Okay.
So, and if you look, the parentheses is really highlighting, that equates to approximately $474 per dwelling unit. So I really just did that to see what does that mean in terms of supplemental SDC. So for alternative A, that funding gap, if you were to do the LWORT realigned, is not a significant increase in supplemental SDC as opposed to alternative B, which is $23,000 on top of our existing SDCs, which I think is probably very unrealistically high and probably not going to ever make anybody pencil.
Yeah, and I would also add that, and I think Keith brought this up, that, I don't think we've done enough to bring the community along as well. In my conversations, I've run across, with the exception of a lot of the lobbyists that have been calling me from the Home Builders Association recently, I've yet to find someone that thinks this is a good idea. And some people are very much against it. The polling showed that we ran, that they're very much against it. And I think we have a responsibility to spend some time with the community and walk them through this and get them to understand how this would work and why it's a benefit to the community at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really, in my mind, that's really important.
Folks, we're approaching the 7:30 time. Have you received as a
Mayor,
city
actually,
enough?
we haven't heard from Councilor Young in terms of kind of where she is, not to put her on the spot, but.
I was just patiently waiting
Yes.
for my turn down here.
Right.
Please go.
I'm of the alternatives. I would prefer A over B, but I'm sort of thinking what Councilor Rosner is. Can that still even be scaled back to more aligning with what our actual housing needs are? Not the 497 because I don't think that's realistic, but because I have actually had conversations with the school board members, and they are concerned. They're not coming out and saying, please don't do this, because that's not, but they have concerns about the number of students that it would add. And one did mention they'd be more comfortable with a smaller ask than the 626 acres. So I don't know what that would look like as far as capital costs and, because we didn't ask you to run that scenario probably.
Yeah, I mean, we can try. I don't know if we were to run numbers April 3rd, I don't know that that's enough time for us to get information together.
Yeah, well, would have to be agreement on what exactly we are looking for in the smaller ask rather than coming to you with
Up again.
4 more alternatives in
Right.
another meeting.
Well, I'm fairly okay with alternative A. I mean, if we're going to go smaller, I think that looks like a comprehensive chunk. It's on at least a couple sides of the school, because that'll give us a street on 2 sides of the school, a full street, as opposed to, we'll still have the prairie land to the north. But I think it's better than, as Sean said, better than having this school out in the middle of this island of dirt and whatever.
I guess, but what is, if we did say no, right? I'm just going to throw this out there. I mean, we talked about some infill issues, but I mean, what's the downside, other than some infill that we'd have to actively manage and put some coding around? What is the downside in waiting 3 to 6 years while we get community support and rebuild our partnership with the schools and make sure this is all aligned? Especially given, we can debate the growth rates all day long. Metro's at 0.8%. Some people think it's higher. I think that's just reading tea leaves at this point. And and to Keith's point, 3 years from now, the Metro rules could be completely different with a different makeup on the council. We just don't know. And I also think we're creating some risk to the phasing, like we talked about. What's the downside of waiting? I mean, I think we could do a lot as a team to address some of the infill issues, try to create some pocket communities, single level homes on smaller lots that, our retirees would love to get into, middle housing options. We have a lot of land that we could play with to do that. This project seems to have gotten some momentum, and I think we should step back and ask the question, what is the downside what's the alternative to, if we were just to say no at this point?
And practically, assuming whatever year we asked, we were successful. Those are two big ifs. Whichever year we asked for the same thing, if we did put our collective shoulder behind the wheel to do the work in the community, how much time would be lost, from doing it in 18 versus 21? A year, maybe worst case 2 years. If you did all the granular detail and didn't take the full 2-year window to put a comp plan in because you did most of the work before you sent the ask in, I don't think you're losing that much, especially if you listen to the development community of it's a minimum of 6 to 10 years before dirt's going to turn. I'm not sure we would lose too much by building goodwill in the community and with our partners. That's my 10 cents.
I'm at this end of the day, us doing the math, and if it takes us, if let's say we don't, and it's not, maybe it doesn't happen in 3 years, then it happens in 6, and then it takes 5 more years to develop and get it ready. That's like 10 or 11 or more years before people can even live out there. And by then, who knows what kind of condition.
Brooklyn probably won't be done by then.
So, it's a crystal ball either way. I just
Right,
feel like
absolutely.
this is one of those stars aligned moments, and maybe we could scale it back, but we should really
the stars
consider.
aligned moment is the mid-year ask. So if we're going for the stars aligned, we could wait till 2021.
Yeah.
I don't think that this would preclude, though, a smaller ask would preclude good planning and community
Absolutely.
input. We've had a lot, and I keep thinking back to the hundreds of people that came to Sherwood West. It was absolutely amazing how many people were involved in Sherwood West through their public input for the meetings that went on. And I don't want to discount all the work that they've done, but certainly I don't think that any of a smaller ask is just what I'm thinking might be like what Russell's talking about, a stars aligning type of thing, would preclude a really solid community outreach, community education visioning. It's been something we've been pushing at for
We will have to do
years.
that regard. If we were successful, there will be a multi-year planning process to determine what actually is going to happen out there as far as zoning and that kind of thing. And then I will also say, as Mayor-elect Mays was talking, I was reminded of Wilsonville, that they actually have asked many, many times, and they still haven't gotten in. So there's no guarantee that we would get
Right.
this time, but there's
Right.
also no guarantee that we would get in 3 years or 6 years or
They're
9
a
years
weird
or 12
group,
years.
Yeah.
Right.
How many years have they asked for Frog Pond, Years.
Since back when I was,
Yeah,
yeah.
I was going to say, there's still a big if in this equation.
right.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, there's a huge if, and, one of the ifs, I just want to remind everybody of is the phasing question. We're taking a chance, I firmly believe, there's a perception that a lot of the property owners out there are just individuals that have had those farms for years. But the reality is a lot of those, not just in our Sherwood West, but in a lot of these areas, there's really large development groups that have bought up that land or have options on that land. And they have deep pockets, so if they don't like the way our annexation rules are going, they don't like the pace, as the phasing that's going on, it's going to get tested, and I am concerned that because Sherwood, in a lot of ways, was a test case for Brookman, right? We could end up being a test case, in terms of, appeals and LUBA appeals and legal action against cities. So it's really new. We really don't know how all of this is going to play out. And in my mind, that adds a lot of risk for us, and especially when it comes to the phasing down the road. I would like to see it. I'd like to see this whole animal settle out a little bit, and why we do some good planning before we take on a risk like that.
So I think in the interest of all the people that are standing out
Yes.
in the lobby,
Yeah, what does staff
can
need
we
from
get
us?
somewhere?
So let me kind of summarize what I think I've heard, which is a mixture of opinions. We're not asking you to vote tonight. I think there's some consensus for the alternative, the smaller alternative. A number of you probably won't vote for that, and I understand that, but if we go down that route, at least to prepare that as the ask, and you engage the public, and you reach out to the school board and say, can we sit down together? You may get to a point within a month where you don't even take a position because you have more information than you have tonight. Just because we're looking for some kind of direction doesn't mean you're going to do that, because there's unanswered questions. I've heard from school board members, they have concerns, exactly what you expressed, Councilor Young. They have not taken an official position. We can invite them to sit down with us and look at this smaller one and get their input and really hear from them directly as a partner and start to rebuild that
So
partnership.
I'd like to move forward then and say to come back on May 2nd with alternative A, and that would be what we would vote on, unless anybody has a major issue with that.
I do for a couple of reasons. The first one is if we were to decide down the road after talking to the schools on May 2nd that we're not going to do an ask, by that time we've adopted this housing needs analysis, and I would be concerned about adopting that before we know for sure, of what we're going to do, because then that becomes a legal document that informs our comprehensive plan, from my understanding. And that document, we're going to talk about it later tonight, in my mind has some problems with it, that we need to talk about and go through. But if if I understand correctly, Julia, timing-wise, we need to get that approved if we're going to do an ask in relatively short order. Is that correct?
Yeah, it needs to be approved through the comp plan update regardless. I mean, we are 30 years out of date on our housing needs analysis, but if we were to do an ask, we would need to have it adopted prior to the ask. So that is
So it could be the same night in theory.
No, it actually, because it has to be acknowledged, so it needs to have gone through the appeal period. It needs to be an acknowledged.
So we can't.
Appeal period.
So we couldn't.
So it has to be a little earlier than the process.
A little bit of meat to the,
Yeah, is that a 30-day appeal?
21 day.
Okay.
21 day.
something to chew on collectively.
Yeah.
And so is there, from the group, are you wanting staff to focus their attention on A, and then it'll be A or nothing, or do you want a whittled down A?
I don't think we are in a position right now to look at a whittled down A. I don't know.
I would be okay with a little down.
Well, but
I
can
think
staff
it's
get
too
there?
I think what I am
big.
thinking is we proceed with A and see if there's any opportunity to provide you options for a whittled down A, but I'm not making any promises.
I'd be okay with that.
And keep in
Certainly
mind,
not wanting staff to waste their time
Right.
and
Yeah.
something that's
keep in
not.
mind that
even
in this
feasible.
direction, I guess I want to stress, because you're not making a decision, but you are providing direction that does have impacts. If we proceed without the full area, and people come on May 2nd to say, we want the full area, it's probably going to be too late for staff to do anything about it at that point, because we won't have time to re-pivot back to the full area. And
I don't think anybody's indicated full area, not that we're
Nobody wants
voting,
don't.
but
For full one or B,
Right.
I think those are both.
And I'm
BOA.
more saying that for
Yeah.
the
the
public,
public.
Okay.
that
Yeah.
that is unfortunately going to be, if we go in the direction of preparing, finalizing the Title 11 concept plan and preparing the narrative and all that stuff, based on the direction that we're receiving now, that will be the decision that you'll be making.
Yeah.
Is yes or no to
well,
that.
I like the idea of at least A, and then if the wizards can pull it
If.
together.
I saw Erica's face, so if.
Can you?
That's why they're over there and I'm over here.
That's right.
But can you do that, Julia, can you do that before we would have to adopt the housing needs analysis? Because I'd rather adopt that after we do the comprehensive plan review if we don't do this, right?
What do the
So
The A,
Have another
The
conversation
housing
about
needs
A.
analysis.
Can you put together that smaller, what they just requested prior to
we
the
do
housing
stuff
needs
by April
analysis?
17th, I guess is the question, because I think April 17th is the last time
That's
that we
Stacy
could
again.
do the housing needs
Now,
analysis.
yeah, so the housing needs analysis, if you declared an emergency, could be done on one night on April 17th. It
Okay.
would have to be a one-night ordinance, because ordinances usually have first readings and second readings.
And just to jump off that,
We're
we're
gonna,
doing
we're
the
gonna
first
talk,
reading tonight.
we're gonna start talking tonight.
You do the
so-
first reading tonight, that would just be the second reading.
Yeah,
And then we could do the second reading April 17th.
right.
Okay.
And then
But could we do, or can we, this is why I'm over here and she's over there. Could we pull it together to get an alternative A by April 17th?
A smaller alternative A?
No, just an
No,
alternative
an
A.
Alternative A.
Maybe.
It might be enough
You
information
think so?
for the 17th to say continue to work forward.
Right,
on
with-
A if
right.
if it.
Well, and that's true, and maybe we aren't going to have,
conceptual.
I think what Carrie's probably thinking about is when your packet is due, and that may be really challenging to get us your, the information for your packet a week before, it's just not
Right.
a
But you
lot
could
of
kind of give
time.
us an update on
But
what
if,
you guys are at.
yeah,
Correct, yeah.
so
Yeah.
try.
I like that.
That's all we can ask.
Yep, that's all we can
And
ask.
then can
Have
we
you
get
got
a
what you need?
session scheduled?
I think with some concerns still, I think we can head in that direction.
Okay.
And then that we should reach out to our community partner and see if. there's
Immediately.
Yes.
You bet.
School district.
a meeting, dinner,
Yep.
lunch, breakfast,
Yep.
Okay.
whatever fits everyone's calendar.
So to summarize what I think I heard, there is lukewarm consensus, not consensus, lukewarm support direction for alternative A, with the hope that we can get you information for an April 17th discussion, and we would still proceed with the housing needs analysis hearing tonight, first reading, but move the second reading to April 17th. In the meantime, you're doing outreach to school district and community partners. Is that?
Everybody okay?
Yeah.
Meeting adjourned. We'll come back for council meeting in 10 minutes.
Only ran 45 minutes long.